God, I thank you that I am not like other people. Really, this prayer is not much of a prayer at all. By his standards, he's done all he needs to do. This particular day wasn't a very good day by my standards. So for it to be a good day, there's a few things I like to happen. I like to feel productive, reliable, patient, and then also make good, healthy choices like diet and exercise. On this day, none of those things happened. My to-do list was a mess, half done, disorganized, overwhelming because I was behind, I wasn't delivering on some things, I had promised people, texts and emails were unanswered. I emailed or texted some of you a little late, a little short actually for some of them. Wasn't great. Projects weren't moving forward, wasn't particularly patient with coworkers or friends either. I felt flustered and frazzled, which are not words I use very often, so if I'm using them, it's usually a good indication that I'm indeed flustered and frazzled. And on top of all that, there's this candy jar that sits on my desk at work. And I tell myself, this candy jar is for guests, friends, coworkers, and students only. In other words, it's not for me, right? And I was on a streak. I hadn't touched this thing since last spring. Pretty impressive for me. Pretty excited. And on this day, I demolished the candy. I probably ate 3 inches off the top of this thing. If you're curious, or if you don't believe me, you think I'm joking, I think I ate 15 to 20 Hershey's Kisses, 7 to 10 Tootsie Rolls, 5 fruit chews that weren't very chewy, 2 Starbursts, and then 1 cherry candy that looked like it was going to be very, very good, and it ended up being quite disappointing. I ate it anyway. In short, I was not productive, I was not reliable, I was not patient, and perhaps least of all, I was not healthy. That was one experience that day. After all of that, I went home late, which means I missed bedtime and dinner time, so Johanna had to take care of these things all by herself. I spent the first 30 minutes upon arriving at home complaining about my day, which I'm sure was very life-giving for Johanna. But Johanna, as she does, listened patiently. And as we were getting in bed and I was getting the last of my complaints out, one of the last things she tells me in a kind, patient, loving tone is, I love you. That's my other experience in the day. These 2 contrasting experiences illustrate 2 different kinds of comfort. One is a false, fragile comfort. It's a comfort that's tied to how well I'm doing or how successfully I'm meeting certain expectations. It's a comfort that only feels good as long as I keep performing, but it quickly disappears when I stumble. The other kind is a true, lasting comfort. It's a comfort that doesn't depend on my daily successes or failures. It comes from knowing I'm secure in a relationship that doesn't waver. Our main focus this morning is on this. True, lasting comfort isn't something we achieve. It's something we receive through God's mercy. True, lasting comfort isn't something we achieve. It's something we receive through God's mercy. Where do we begin before God? The Pharisee and the tax collector from this parable help us better understand the postures that lead to these 2 different kinds of comfort. And a good place to start is by noticing their initial understanding of themselves. First, we look at the Pharisee. He enters the temple with confidence. And quite frankly, it seems he has good reason to feel this way. If we take him at his word, he seems like a good guy. He's not a robber, an evildoer, or an adulterer. All good things to avoid. He's also giving 1/10 of all that he has. He's fasting twice a week. He seems devoted, genuine, generous, all good things. And this aligns with what we knew about the Pharisees from these times. They were respected, devout people. They were seen as the standards of righteous living. If you needed someone to trust, if you needed someone to hold your wallet or purse, these are the people you would ask. These were good, trustworthy people. These were the good guys. People wanted to be like them. But notice the Pharisees' prayer. God, I thank you that I am not like other people. Robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and give a tenth of all I get. Really, this prayer is not much of a prayer at all. It's more like a speech or a resume where he's highlighting his accomplishments. He never actually asks God for anything, probably because he doesn't think he needs anything. By his standards, he's done all he needs to do. Where does the Pharisee begin? The Pharisee begins with the understanding that he measures up. He measures up. He's confident he meets the standard, that he's done what's required, and because of that, he's righteous. Right before God because of what he's done. We can contrast this with the tax collector. The tax collector approaches God differently. He stands far off. He's unwilling to even look up to heaven. He beats his chest in grief and shame. And like the Pharisee, his behavior would seem fitting for those who knew tax collectors back in this time. Tax collectors were not well liked. They were considered traitors. In a time when God's chosen nation of Israel was ruled by the Roman Empire, the tax collectors chose not to resist the empire, but to seek employment from them. If the Pharisee was the person you trust with your wallet or purse, to hold it, to trust, that they're not going to take anything, the tax collector was the opposite. These are the people you would not trust with these things. These were the bad guys. You did not want to be them. But the tax collector in Jesus' parable doesn't deny any of this. He knows exactly who he is before God. And his prayer reflects this. God, have mercy on me, sinner. There's no resume here, no comparisons. He knows he has a problem and no way to fix it himself. Where does the tax collector begin? The tax collector begins with a clear understanding that he falls short. He falls short. He knows he doesn't measure up. He recognizes he's unrighteous. He's not right before God. We can probably relate to some of this. Like the Pharisee, many of us look for comfort by beginning with our own resumes. We work hard to measure up, to be productive, reliable, patient, healthy. Because deep down, we believe that comfort only comes if we perform well enough. But, as my experience this week reminded me, this approach is exhausting and fragile. The moment we fail, when the to-do list unravels, when patience runs thin, when the candy jar is empty, we quickly realize how shaky this kind of comfort is. The tax collector shows us a different posture. He begins not with a resume, but with humility. He doesn't try to hide his failures or pretend he's got it all together. Instead, he acknowledges honestly and openly that he falls short. The second question we can answer is, how do we relate to God? And again, we can look at the Pharisee and the tax collector side by side to better understand this contrast. The Pharisee begins from an understanding that he measures up. He believes he's met all the standards. And when we look at his prayer/speech, it becomes clear that his entire approach to God is based on his merit. He relates to God by his merit. In his eyes, he's earned the right to stand before God. But the tax collector comes from a different place. He knows that he falls short. He has no merit, no good deeds to stand on. Instead, he recognizes that his only way of relating to God is through God's mercy. He He relates to God through God's mercy. He prays, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And this word he's using for mercy relates to this idea of atonement. Atonement means being made right with God, often through a sacrifice that pays for sin. The tax collector isn't just asking for a second chance. He's asking God to provide something he knows he can't provide for himself. He's acknowledging that he needs a sacrifice beyond himself to make him right with God. His prayer is actually foreshadowing Christ's sacrifice. And we can relate here as well. Just like the Pharisee, when we focus on our spiritual resumes, productivity, reliability, patience, health, whatever it is, we try to relate to God based on merit. Our comfort depends entirely on how good we've been. We've performed well. We feel justified in approaching God. If not, we're not performing well. We've not done what we need to, feel we need to. We feel distant, insecure, unworthy. But again, the tax collector points us toward a different path. He doesn't rely on his own goodness. Instead, he humbly acknowledges that his comfort can only come through God's mercy. Now, to further clarify this contrast, we can turn to our third question. What experience follows? In other words, after all of this, after their prayers and postures before God, what attitudes or responses follow their interactions with God? The Pharisee again begins with confidence, as this understanding that he measures up, relates to God based on his own merit. What experience naturally follows this posture? This is pride. He feels proud. As long as he can maintain his exemplary resume, he feels pretty good about himself. But again, this pride is fragile. It's completely dependent on his continued success, leaving him vulnerable and likely anxious when he fails to measure up. The tax collector begins with humility and a clear awareness of his shortcomings. He relates to God based on God's mercy. What experience follows this posture? This is one of gratitude. He's received something he didn't deserve. God has freely provided what he couldn't achieve on his own, so his response can only be gratitude. And maybe you can relate here as well. On those days when you don't feel you measure up, maybe or when you do measure up, maybe you checked off the to-do list, you've kept your patience going, you've made good choices, these kinds of things. You feel that. You feel pride. You're proud of yourself. But again, that kind of comfort is fragile, because the moment we fall short, it disappears. Pride only lasts as long as our success. The tax collector, again, experiences something different. His posture before God isn't based on performance, and what follows isn't anxiety or self-righteousness. Instead, he experiences deep gratitude, rooted in what God has done for him. Together, all of these things lead us to one last question. What comfort results? So first, look again at the Pharisee. He has false, fragile comfort. His comfort depends entirely on his ability to perform. He has to measure up, to keep doing the right things, to avoid doing the wrong things. He needs to keep his hand out of the candy jar. He needs to stay productive, maintain his disciplined practices, continue achieving his place before God. As long as he can perform, he achieves this false, fragile comfort. But again, this comfort is fragile. Eventually, his performance will fail. Eventually, he'll have a day, like mine earlier this week, where his efforts collapse. And when that happens, that comfort he's built his life around, this false, fragile comfort, based on his performance, will crack and it will break. Instead of pride, he'll feel despair. His comfort only lasts as long as his success, and when the success stops, comfort disappears. But the tax collector finds something different. He receives true, lasting comfort. His comfort doesn't depend on his ability to perform because he freely acknowledges that he can't measure up. He admits openly that he's fallen short. And he stood walking away, justified and comforted. Why? Because he approaches God not based on his own merit, but through God's mercy. If we want the true, lasting comfort that comes from knowing we are not our own, but belong, body and soul, in life and in death, to our faithful Savior, Jesus Christ, then we first need to acknowledge our need like the tax collector did. We need to realize that we fall short. We can only relate to God through his mercy, and that his mercy frees us to live gratefully. If we don't embrace this truth, we remain trapped. We're going to be chasing after false, fragile comfort. But if we humbly recognize our need and rest fully on the mercy of Christ, we find a comfort that endures forever.